Okay, so welcome to Cladding Question Time with Manchester and Liverpool Gladiators. Today marks the one-year anniversary since we travelled down to Parliament to hold a lobby in Parliament Square, pleading for the government to end our cladding scandal. Greater Manchester High-Rise Task Force came up with the idea of the lobby, led by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, and Salford City Mayor Paul Dennett. But we were grateful to be joined by a whole host of supportive MPs, other city mayors and leaseholder action groups from across the country. 2 weeks after that lobby, the government announced the £1 billion Building Safety Fund to pay for removal of dangerous non-ACM cladding systems. The Building Safety Fund was not enough in size or scope, and so we continued our campaign to ensure that millions of victims caught up in this crisis received funding for building issues which were of no fault of their own. In December 2020, the government announced a Waking Watch Fund to relieve the costs of Waking Watch by paying for alarms to be fitted. This was welcomed, but the £13 million is clearly not enough for all buildings that need help, and there is no funding for people who have already had to pay Waking Watch costs for months on end and pay for new alarms costing thousands of pounds per leaseholder. As all of you know, on 10th February this year, the government announced £3.5 billion of further funding to remove non-ACM cladding systems from buildings over 18 metres. They also announced a loan scheme for the removal of cladding from buildings between 11 and 18 metres tall. But why should they only get a loan and not a grant just because their building is lower in height? Why should there be no funding at all for non-cladding fire safety issues, which are deemed dangerous enough to require remediation and currently prevent a building from receiving an EWS1 form, but they're not dangerous enough for funding? These are topics which we'll be discussing tonight with our fantastic panel. So tonight we're joined by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, Canon Chancellor and Director of Social Justice of Liverpool Cathedral, Ellen Loudon, Mayor of Liverpool City Region, Steve Rotheram, Head of Enforcement and Building Safety Reform at Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, Jenni Seex, Architect and Campaigner, George Clarke, and Minister for Building Safety, Lord Stephen Greenhalgh. We will have questions from some of the residents in our audience. We were inundated with questions for our panel, as you can imagine, receiving over 100 questions. But you'll appreciate that we could only pick a handful, so we selected topics that were raised most often and most frequently. But there will be a chance for audience participation, as we'll be running some polls for those people who are joining us live, and there will also be a Q&A function for you to use for any comments. But as always, we ask you to be polite. So without further delay, let's begin with our first question from Vicky Jaycock. So Vicky, I understand that you live in a flat in Liverpool. Do you want to briefly tell us what the building issues are that you're facing? She's there. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Vicky. So you're in Liverpool. Do you want to give us brief details of the issues of your building?
Yes, so thank you, Rebecca. I'm an owner in a Pall Mall Apartments based in the heart of Liverpool city centre in L3. The building is 15 years old and is over 18 metres. And from the pursuit of the EWS1 form, we were found to have unsafe other areas of the building which provide fire risks.
Okay, and do you know what sort of costs you're facing individually?
No, we were pleased that the application for the grant for the cladding was accepted, but we're just on a waiting game now really to find out what the costs for the remedial work for balconies and also fire vents will be, which will be at the cost of the owners, I'm told.
Okay, thank you. So do you want to ask your question of the panel?
Yes, certainly. I've probably summed a little bit up in that introduction. So I'd like to ask what measures will be in place to support owners who've been notified of fire safety risks, which now need rectifying. And these do include the example I've used, such as wooden balconies. These costly works are not going to be covered in the government grant.
So Lord Greenhalgh, is that, are you able to respond to that? There's obviously these other issues that aren't covered by the fund, so what measures are in place for people like Vicky?
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to both Manchester Gladiators and Liverpool Gladiators for getting such a stellar panel. And I'm sure that I'll be facing quite a few spiky questions, and so I'll do my very best to answer. Vicky, the first thing is that the 3.5 billion covers the remediation of the external cladding system. So where the cladding system also incorporates the internal compartmentation or the balcony, that would also be included. So it's not just the cladding per se, it's the extent of the cladding system and what that extends to. So that'll vary from building to building. But let's assume that that these are defects that you need to remediate that are outside the scope of the fund. Well, I mean, the first thing, what is the government doing? Well, the first thing the government needs to do is ensure that this doesn't happen again. And that's why I have responsibility for both fire and building safety. And we're bringing forward the legislation through the fire safety bill, the building safety bill, and also the fire safety consultation that we're carrying out to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again. It's happened now over decades. So you talk about your building, I think a little over 10 years old, 15 years old. And there's the building regulations such as they are today and such as they were when the building was built would not have allowed a building to be built without proper internal compartmentation measures, without the fire breaks and other things that are missing. So, what we've seen with the ACM fund with the same cladding as Grenfell is in about half the cases, building owners did step up and through redress and using warranties and so forth, managed to claw back through insurance warranties, but also pursuing the original developers. We have been able to ensure that costs did not fall on leaseholders. So there still is a strong chance through redress, effectively, to pay for those items that are not covered by government grant.
And Steve, obviously, Vicky lives in Liverpool. I mean, what are your views on these buildings that have various issues that aren't covered by the current funding?
Well, it was interesting to hear His Lordship talking about what the government are doing, but whilst it is better than nothing, it's not the complete solution because residents are still facing the same sort of problems because they've been excluded from being covered by all of the eventualities of what's happened in the past. So my call is, thanks very much for everything that we've been able to squeeze out of government so far. It's very welcome, but it doesn't go far enough. And for Vicky, and obviously I know the Pall Mall building that she's talking about, and I'm working with the local council, Liverpool City Council in this instance, and some of their executive members to represent residents in the buildings that are affected. And we'll continue to try to exert some pressure on national government, but it does need the government to find the solutions. The problems have been identified, and the one group that is not to blame for this are the people who are living in tinderboxes. And in all honesty, it's all right having people walking around buildings and all that sort of stuff. I understand why residents would be fearful of even going to sleep. And we've seen the terrible events have happened with these sorts of cladding materials used on external envelopes of buildings. And it's not just about not being able to get rid of the property that you're in. It's about your quality of life and your mental health. And we're going to have lots and lots of issues that we'll have to deal with outside of the huge sums of money that are being bandied around.
And I think that's the thing, we're many years on from Grenfell and people are living with this every day. Like Ellen, Vicky's also in your city, what's your sort of view on, what people like Vicky are having to live through at the moment?
I think it's absolutely. I'm so sorry, Vicky, that you're going through this. I mean, if frankly, if you had a car or you had a washing machine in your home, and it is your home, then it would be covered. And many of the companies that have recently recalled products because of faulty parts or faulty engines or faulty mechanisms. And it seems really outrageous to me that you in your own home have not got the same recourse to go back to those people who have built them, and that you as an individual have to carry this. I mean, it should be a kind of a national collection of, you know, the government should take responsibility to chasing down the people who have put you in this situation. And, you know, Steve and many of us are just really concerned that you are being left as an individual to have to carry this.
And Vicky, what you know, how do you feel sort of listening to what Lord Greenhalgh has said, and Steve and Ellen?
Thank you. Obviously, I'm focused on future-proofing so that it doesn't happen again. But, you know, from probably a selfish point of view, that doesn't help my situation at the moment, as our building management has sought legal counsel regarding the original developer and architect, and have been told that as it's 15 years since the building was built, they're not able to claim anything from that in terms of compensation. So that's not a route that we'd have to go into, and any further exploration of that is only going to add to mounting legal costs, which we don't feel is fair.
Well, that's it. You shouldn't have to take that on or risk the adverse costs that you could be ordered to pay by the developers. So we'll come on to discuss sort of the actions against the developers a bit more shortly. So thanks very much, Vicky.
Yeah.
We'll move on now to a question from Georgie Hume. So Georgie joins us from a building in Manchester, in Hume, obviously like by name, by building. So I think Georgie should be there now.
Sorry, this is all my fault. In the background. Apologies.
User error, Giles.
You ready, Georgie?
Pofters, bastards, cockface, shoes, peanuts, bastards.
That'll be Georgie.
That's Georgie. Georgie's on.
You knob.
Georgie, can you give us just a brief description of your building and then what your question is?
Bastards, peanuts, bastards.
Hi, my name is Georgie Hume, and I am a leaseholder at the Live buildings.
Fuck off.
We have timber cladding,
Bastards.
timber on
Fuck off.
balconies, compartmentalization issues, and who knows what else.
Fuck off.
I am co-founder of Cladding, a direct action group for disabled leaseholders. I desperately want to stay in my flat, but as reliant on state benefits, I can only see bankruptcy as the outcome.
Fuck off, bastards, wankers, fannies, chickens, bastards.
And then what's your question, Georgie?
Cockheads, bastard, pufters, bastards.
My development is a mix of buildings, one above 18 meters and 3 under 18 meters. I live in the under 18 meter building, and despite us having exactly the same safety issues as the above 18 meter buildings and the buildings being connected, I have been refused help by the government. The loan scheme will not cover all the other issues here, so my first question is to Jenni Seex, as I want to ask CAD if it would be possible to have a medium-rise task force, similar to the high-rise task force that has worked so well in Greater Manchester. I would also like to ask Lord Greenhalgh what he is specifically doing to help disabled leaseholders, as he has told us he understands the issues disabled people face and he would meet with us. But he has not replied to our last 4 emails chasing up a meeting. Why are we being ignored?
Bastards, chickens, bastard.
Brilliant, thanks, Georgie.
Bastard, chickens, woohoo, cockface.
So obviously the first question to Jenni Seex. So obviously the high-rise task force has had quite a lot of success in Greater Manchester. So and you've got medium-rise buildings at the moment that are, you know, haven't got access to the funding. So you know, is it possible to have a medium-rise task force?
I think really the high-rise task force was set up by Andy, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, very shortly after Grenfell, when obviously that was a high-rise building, and a lot of the advice and emerging evidence for at least 2 years after Grenfell was in relation to high-rise buildings, and the advice notes from government and the independent expert panel were targeted at those buildings. I'm sure everybody on the call will be aware that there are different requirements under the building regulations for buildings over 18 metres. One of the things we have done in Greater Manchester is repeatedly raise that height is not the only determinant of risk. And we have seen incidents in buildings that are under 18 metres. Last year in January, the what's called the consolidated advice note that was published then applied to all buildings. And since that point, really, we have been looking at the issue much more holistically. It's not restricted to high rise. So we have got a number of buildings that are under 18 metres that have interim measures. We've done work, when we do work proactively with housing providers and managing agents through events, we're talking about buildings holistically. Last March, we worked on a risk prioritisation tool to help housing providers and managing agents assess the, prioritise across their portfolios of stock. And we've shared that through the work that we do with MHCLG and the Home Office. And I know that the Home Office are looking at how they develop that as a national piece of guidance and risk prioritisation to support buildings when the fire safety bill comes in. So although it's still called the High Rise Task Force, and I think that name is, there's probably a bit of brand recognition now because of the work that has been done in Greater Manchester and also the work that has been done with the Cladiators and with residents. We're not just looking at buildings over 18 metres. We do recognise that those issues do affect a range of other buildings. I know the question around disabled leaseholders was not directed to me, but I should probably say that's an area where we recognise that we probably need to do more because of the scale of this issue. And, I've got some knowledge of George's building particularly, but in terms of Cladding, we've made contact through our, through the work that we've already done with Georgie, and we're looking at how we engage them more in the work that we do, both with the task force, but also in our core work as Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. So things like our prevention messaging, but obviously there's a lot of work still needs to be done around issues of evacuation, how we make sure that people feel supported and that they know that if there is unfortunately an incident in their building, that our firefighters will be able to get to them, and we're exploring a range of solutions and we'll be engaging with Cladding on that. So in terms of the name, I'm not the task force, I support it, so I'll probably defer to Andy, and it's probably something that will be raised at the next meeting around the name.
Yeah, so Andy, what are your views on this? Obviously, we represent a lot of buildings that are under 18 metres and just feel a bit kind of lost and abandoned, really. So, what are your views on the idea of a medium-rise task force? Not necessarily in the name, but what are your views on that?
Evening, everybody, and thanks to you, Rebecca, and Manchester Cladiators, local Cladiators, as Stephen said, for bringing us all together. And thanks to the Minister actually for being here, because it's good that he's in the room and in the conversation. So thank you. And George, your question's a really fair one, a fair challenge. And I will ask City Mayor of Salford, Paul Dennett, who leads on these issues for us. I think we should rename our task force and broaden its scope. That's just a sort of first response, but I think we should. And the reason I say that is because of the experience we had in Bolton in late 2019 with the fire at the Cube. That was a shocking event, actually, for everybody who witnessed what was happening on social media that night. And I visited the scene with others the next day, and I hadn't really understood the complications at that point when Jenni and others explained it to me. The Cube just under 18 metres. I think actually technically, but it was classed as the ground. Anyway, from where you measure it, it wasn't 8, so it was classed as not as medium rise rather than high rise. But actually the task force had picked it up, to be fair, and had visited as part of the work that Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue had done. But, anyone who looked at that fire that night, and I remember hearing actually on the point about disability, one of the disabled students had been carried down the stairs that night to get out. And that sticks in my mind absolutely, which would be worrying, I guess, for Georgie and others to hear that, that those issues were very, very real at the Cube. So the issue is this, and I would say this to the government, in all sort of, respect, but the issue is not well, height is an issue, but it's certainly not the defining issue. The defining issue is the cladding. That's the thing, isn't it, that needs to be removed and removed fairly. And to say that people who live in buildings that have cladding that are below 80 metres are treated differently from those who live in buildings above, I can't see how that is justifiable from a human rights and fairness point of view, to be honest. So, you know, I think that needs looking at again. To say that people in those buildings need to pay a loan pretty much for the rest of their life is not a tenable solution, I'm afraid. So, you know, I think we absolutely need justice for people in buildings below 18 metres. None of this is their fault. They need to live in a safe building. They can't be sort of, you know, who looks at the height of the building when they're buying a flat? Nobody. And you can't sort of have, you know, one rule for people in flats above 80 metres and one for those below. I just don't think it applies that way. And the cube is the example of why it shouldn't apply that way. And I just would like to make clear, Rebecca, that although she looks like she is, Jenni is not actually the Mayor of Greater Manchester. She's obviously just sitting in my throne for the evening while I'm stuck at home. But so she is, really she is. I mean, she tells me all I need to know about. But Jenni and the task force have done a brilliant job. And Georgia, I'm going to accept your challenge and say, you know, the scope of the work, the brilliant work they've done now needs to go a bit further and deeper and address all of the issues faced by people living in buildings below 18 metres. And I will put that to the City Mayor of Salford, and we'll see if we can get that change made.
Brilliant, thanks, Andy. And Lord Greenhalgh, obviously, Georgie raised that they've written to you a couple of times, and she wants to know, you know, what are the government doing to help disabled leaseholders?
Well, first of all, Georgie, I want to apologise that you haven't had a response from my office. That's not something that, so when I got the questions, I just felt very bad about that, because that's not my intention. And you know that, Rebecca, and others that are on the call, that I try to make myself available. And so there's been, I'm really sorry that that's happened, and we'll make sure we get back to you. A couple of things, really. I think the issue of disability is a very critical one, and it's something that we're reconsulting, in fact, on the issue of personal emergency evacuation plans. So that's something that, you know, we recognise that in any building where we have risk, that there needs to be, and with disabled leaseholders, we need to make sure that those are in place as part of the fire risk assessment. So that's carrying. That's going to be carried out shortly, and more of information will be available on the government's website. I would also say that I recognise the point about height. I think I find it difficult. I'd like to disagree with Andy. I don't disagree with Andy on that. However, I mean, the Home Office statisticians that look at fire-related fatalities and the likelihood of people ending up in hospital with injuries that need to be treated in hospital, if you look at that per 1,000 buildings, I mean, the raw statistics say you are 4 times more likely to have a fire-related fatality or end up needing hospital treatment in a building between 18 and 30 metres, and then that rises to 35 times more likely in a building above 30 metres. So I don't think we need to recognise that height is a factor. It's just, as Andy said, it's not the only factor. I take the point about the cube, and that's one of the reasons why we set access to funding at being anything above 6 stories to capture the cube scenario that Andy described. At the end of the day, with something of this scale, there are only ever going to be 3 levers which are going to be part of the solution. The first is government grant, alongside actually very hard work by politicians and civic leaders like Andy and Steve in getting the developers to step up and do the right thing. Actually working very, very closely together at all layers of government, we can bring them to the table, even if the statute of limitations has been passed. So I think that's very, very important to say that is important to do that. Yes, grant is important, but also we need to have the levies and the taxes to recoup it, to make sure the people that cause this problem make the contribution. And lastly, you know, some of these issues, a financing scheme may well be the right answer to do that, because it may be the only answer. And not having the bill up front with 28 days to pay, but paying that over many, many years and at a low level is better than not having any other solution. So I think, you know, I would make the case that financing schemes can be a way to solve the overall problem.
Okay, well, let's see. We're going to come on to talk about developers shortly. We're just going to run a poll now for the audience members. So I'll hand over to Giles, who is just going to update us on what's been happening in the comments as well.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the comments. So hopefully you can hear me. I don't think anyone really needs or wants to see my face. 33 questions. Few on developers and insurance. We're going to come up to insurance next. So I'm going to run a poll for you now. And given that we're slightly over time, I'll launch it here. Hopefully you can all see it. Fingers crossed. So if everyone can vote on that poll, how much has your most recent building's insurance charge? Oh, results coming in. So I'll keep that running for a few more seconds. As I say, there's a few different questions, a lot of the ones that we are aware of or have already come up in the hot topics, for want of a better word. So we'll be coming on to insurance next and developers a little later. Apologies, I did think I'd be able to answer everyone's, but I'm not sure that's going to be feasible. So polls, I'm going to end the polling now, 40 seconds at 150, keep going, keep clicking it. So I'm going to end the polling and you'll see the results now. So, as you can see there, the majority is that most people's building insurance is increased by 200 to 499%. Wow. And just to point out that we'll be meeting with Lord Greenhalgh and MHCLG on Monday on this and a couple other topics. Thank you.
So obviously you can see those results there. You know, insurance is a real issue for people living in these buildings. You know, it escalates the cost for them massively. So we're going to move on to our next question, which is on insurance. So Hans de Biesing is joining us. He owns an apartment in Manchester. Hans, are you there?
We'll be there in a second. You ready, Hans? I think I need a bit more training.
Oh.
Hi, Hans. Can you hear us?
Good evening, everybody. Indeed, the insurance cost has become a major problem and a financial burden for leaseholders across the UK. To give you an example from my personal experience in Manchester, our insurance costs have increased by over £280,000, which is about 180% increase for for our leaseholders. And in addition to that, we're going to have over £160,000 of additional costs to implement new fire safety measures. So what have I done to deserve such a punishment? It's incredible and very and unacceptable. So I would like to know, what measures the government could take, to contain these soaring insurance increases, and if they could be capped, to some extent.
Thanks, Hans. So yeah, Hans lives in a building as well that has combustible kingspan insulation, which obviously has had a lot of press coverage recently. So if I'd go to George, what's your sort of view on this and the escalating insurance costs for these buildings? It's costing people thousands of pounds just for the insurance.
Well, I'm not an insurance broker. I'm an architect at the end of the day. Just before I kind of get into this specific question, I think what Grenfell has done is opened up a Pandora's box, a kind of Pandora's tinderbox, really. And it's frightening because when I hear so many different stories, not just from the Manchester and Liverpool Cladiators, but across the country, every building is unique. And most of the buildings, even though they might have quite similar problems, they've also got unique problems as well. And this is a classic case where we've had systematic failure, which has created one of the worst disasters I've ever seen and personally seen, because I was there that night at Grenfell. I live about 80 meters away from Grenfell Tower and I was at home that night. It's opened up a Pandora's box of major faults within the industry when it comes to building standards, quality testing, and also inspections. And it raises lots of questions, not just about the morals of companies who provide certain products and test those products. It also raises questions about the architectural industry. It also raises questions about building control and who's actually inspecting this work and who's certifying and approving it. And then on top of all that, who's providing insurances and indemnities of those projects over a certain period of time. And what's happened is, because we've had this massive disaster, there's been an enormous analysis of virtually every single building, certainly high-rise buildings. And that's opened up lots of different problems and issues that may be general or specific to that building. And we've all been campaigning for cladding, and I commend the government for the amount of money that's been released. I really do. It's a big pot of money. And in some ways, I feel like we've shot ourselves in the foot because we've been pushing for cladding and cladding safety. But because buildings have been interrogated at such a high level, some that have been built, as you mentioned before, 18 years ago, 20 years ago, you're starting to discover huge problems beyond cladding, which is generating a massive level of risk. So my overall point is we've opened this Pandora's box of huge complexity, and government have now tried to step in. And as I say, I commend them for doing it. But when government do step in, a lot of the time it can be quite general and it fixes a certain number of problems. But because we've had this high level of interrogation of many different building types, we've found different problems that aren't then covered by the fund. On top of that, you've got levels of responsibility that might be at a different level as well. So, for example, insurances might have run out, warranties might have run out, buildings might have been sold on by a developer to someone else who is now the freeholder, who's taken responsibility for that building. And they're saying, well, actually, that's not already our problem. We didn't realize there was that level of risk when it was done. So one of the reasons why we're having such a complicated debate tonight, and an hour is not enough, by the way. I mean, we could probably talk about this for about 6 weeks relentlessly on a single Zoom call, is because it's very hard to bring in general ways of fixing very unique problems on very complicated buildings that are in different parts of the country with different levels of risk. And I could go out and analyze myself personally, 20 different buildings of different height and different forms of construction that were built at a different time, and probably come up with many different lists about how they should be put right. So I just wanted to say that because it's painting a picture of just how complicated this is. And I can understand why people have got individual frustrations because they feel like their problems haven't been answered by generic ways of fixing it. When it comes to insurance premiums, I'm not going to get into too much detail about that. I said that at the beginning. I'm not an architect, but I do see that insurance premiums have gone up at such a high level. People are saying, well, why should I have to pay for that? And I come back to Ellen's point at the very, very beginning. Let's say you have a fault in a car, in the car industry. And let's say a certain manufacturer realized that there's a fault in that specific product. They will then recall that. Your insurance premiums wouldn't go up on that car purely because you had a car that was at fault. But the difference is you can go straight to that manufacturer and say that they were to blame because it's a single point of call to be able to say, well, you designed it, you built it, we bought it from you, therefore you can take responsibility for it. We're in a situation now where I'm not saying people are entirely avoiding blame, because there are some good developers out there and good manufacturers who realize there might have been systematic failure and they want to try and solve it. But you've also got people who are doing everything they possibly can to avoid being blamed for the problems of a building. So this is a systematic problem, which I think the government needs to start to address about who is actually, at the end of the day, responsible for particular failures in a building. Now, I'm not saying it's the government's responsibility to find out exactly who that is. It might be that it happens to the courts, for example, which is a long, tedious, awful process and doesn't solve the immediate problem. But you can't, I've just compared it to the car industry, Ellen did, and it's a natural thing for us to do. But that is a single manufacturer with individual warranties, with individual responsibilities. I think what we've discovered post-Grenfell is that there are way bigger problems that are spread across the entire industry. And just to finish on one very quick point, it's slightly comparable to the Bradford fire that happened in football stadiums back in the day. Once that disaster happened, I think a lot of the stadium industry looked at each other and said, how could we have timber boards, that weren't treated properly, being bench seating and predominantly a timber structure. It seemed madness, didn't it, after the disaster happened? But what could happen was when the government intervened and stadium designers intervened, we realized that we could go to clubs and get them and help them directly to change those buildings. The problem, and in fairness, football clubs have got an awful lot of money, as we know, at the very upper echelons of football. They were then able to build new stadiums, and hence why we've seen a complete and quite an amazing, if you like, regeneration of buildings, not just retrofitting and making them safe, but also new stadiums being built. Now, you can't do that with people's houses because they've bought them already and they live there. And there's not that single point of call that you can go directly to a club or a car manufacturer to help this situation out. It's way more complicated than that. And in some ways, that's because the house building industry is a free market with lots of different people involved. It's way more complicated. Sorry, that was a very long question, a long answer to an insurance story.
But all very good points though. I think so, like Lord Greenhalgh, we've spoken to you a few times about, you know, the insurance, and I think it's galling when people find out there's huge broker fees as well for, you know, arranging pretty much the same product as before. You know, what can be done about this to try and reduce these costs?
Thanks, Rebecca. Well, first of all, we are going to have that round table that was, I think, scheduled. It's happening early next week. I think Giles referred to it. The basically broadly three things that can be done. Firstly, we can look at a market solution. And that would obviously be the easiest for government, because what I think we've realised, and that's by talking to the cladding groups, is that those that are in buildings that are in single ownership often face higher insurance than those where there are multiple buildings. And that's because the risk can be pooled when you're part of a group of buildings. So I think we've certainly been in discussions with organisations like BIBA at seeing whether there is a market solution that could potentially pool the risk. That's one route to go, and that's really building on that insight that groups of buildings enable you to reduce overall risk for each building if you can aggregate the risk. The second thing is the indirect interventions, and that's why I think the roundtable next week is very important. That we do hold the feet to the fire of these insurers, that they don't profiteer on the back of Grenfell, and that they don't charge ridiculous hikes in premium, because why has the risk changed from this year versus last year? It's still the same building. So, you know, I mean, there may be some reasons that they can give as an industry, but it's important we understand those. But prima facie, it doesn't seem to be justified. And I think making the moral case, making them aware of the situation of each building, and that it's not all the same. And the point that's just been made by George, I think is important. So indirect intervention is another course. And then the last thing is obviously the government steps in. Now, I'm a minister in a spending department, and as soon as you say government steps in, that basically means, you know, the taxpayer to a degree, and therefore Treasury have to agree to it. But those broadly are the options that we can take when it comes to that are open to take in terms of how we can help as a government.
Okay, thank you. And I think, you know, we welcome these conversations because, you know, it seems like we've been talking about it for a long time, and yet every month, you know, huge bills are landing for this. So we really need to do something.
Can I just come back on that point, Rebecca? Do you mind?
Nope.
I think one of the reasons why insurers are starting to push up premiums is because of that level of increased integrity and inspection that's been happening over the last couple of years. You know, we've had lots of buildings built that somehow have been signed off that in lots of respects might not have fully complied with the current building regulations, including fire regulations, not just other building regs. And that's where I think there's been this major systematic failure, that for whatever reason, somehow buildings have been signed off that don't conform to the current levels of the building regulations for fire safety. And now they've been interrogated, people who are leaseholders are now getting these long lists of all the things retrospectively that need to be put right. I'll give you one of the simplest examples in the world. A very, very good friend of mine who lives in a high-rise building that's over 18 meters. Once the inspection had been carried out, they'd realized there was two things. One, there was an extension made at the top of the building that was built out of combustible cladding. Now that's only the top 2 floors. So there was an additional amount of build added at a later date. Now, because of that, everybody in the building is being made to pay increased insurance and service charges because of those 2 stories that were added at a later date. And they also discovered that there was no self-closers put on any of the fire doors. which were the main doors to each apartment of the building. Now, that is completely against building regulations. How the hell that building was signed off without self-closers on the main doors to each individual apartment is beyond me. I mean, that's negligent by somebody somewhere. I'm not going to say who it was because it's never been fully interrogated yet. But the last people that should be paying is the people that bought that apartment, because it should have happened at the point that the building was built and the point that it was signed off. And I think this is where we're falling into quite a frightening world, that the default position of the industry at the minute is, well, leaseholders have to pay. Because obviously in the leaseholder contract, it will say any works that need to be carried out to the building at any point to make it safe need to be met by the leaseholders. Well, I'm sorry, the building should have been made when it was built and before those apartments were even bought. That should not be the responsibility of leaseholders to pay that money. So that's just a little example of how I think the level of interrogation that's happened post-Grenfell has opened up this Pandora's box of individual bills. And everyone's default position is, well, it's not the architect's fault, it's not building regs' fault, it's not even the insurers who might have indemnified the building at the beginning. Or, do you know, we'll just get leaseholders to pay because we've got a leaseholders agreement saying it's their responsibility to do it. It's not their responsibility to put things right that were defective or illegal at the point it was built. And this is why we're getting into a very difficult scenario between buildings. Sorry to jump in on that, but I think it was an important point.
No, that's fine. And, yeah, and it is. And, you know, as far as we're concerned, you know, there are developers that need to step forward and do the right thing. And a lot of them are hiding behind limitation periods, like Lord Greenhalgh referenced before. So we just need to move on. We're going to move on to a question about the Building Safety Fund application process. So we've got Todor on the line with us. So yeah, Todor owns a flat in Manchester, which I believe you bought in 2018, so very recently. So do you want to just give us a brief idea about what the issues are with your building and then ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. So yeah, I bought my apartment indeed in 2018 as a first-time buyer. So I was really excited about it. I spent nearly £30,000 in renovations to the property. So I can bring it to the standard I was happy with. However, now due to the cladding issues related to the building, the property is effectively worthless, at least to some of the banks. There are a number of safety issues related to the building. It's above 18 meters. But the main part is the timber cladding, which is present in most parts of the building, including the fire escapes, the fire escape routes, the hallways and the balconies. Our property management company applied for the Building Safety Fund back in July last year, and we've still not had a decision on the application. My question is actually threefold. Why is it taking so long to get an approval? What can you do to give us, the leaseholders, more visibility into the approval process? And how can you speed up the decision making?
So obviously it's about the Building Safety Fund application. Lord Greenhalgh, you know, are you able to shed any light on this, on the delays in the application process?
Well, first of all, I've got a chart here, which I get a weekly chart, and I think it's helpful to give what's causing some of the delays, because we've had, I think, 2,000. It's down here, 2,820 total registrations, and it's fair to say that the biggest single reason why applications are not progressing, according to this chart, is the inadequacy of the information that's provided as part of the application. So, and that's still, I mean, there's about 911 is the latest stat. It was 1,053, but that is the single quickest way that we can get these applications processed. To answer directly the question, conversely, nearly 1,000. So we've got it's actually 886 decisions have been made on the basis that we have sufficient information, and but within that 532. Sorry, my eyesight's not great. 532 registered buildings are proposing and are proceeding with full applications. So. You know, I think that's in terms of. I think the second question was, we do expect registrants to keep residents informed. So I know from actually discussion and dialogue with you, Rebecca, that's where things are breaking down. The information flow isn't what we would expect, but certainly the BSF registrations team are keen to provide any information if that isn't working, but we would expect residents to be kept informed and leaseholders to be kept informed of the progress of the application.
Just in response to that part then, so how would leaseholders do that then? Because as I say, they're kind of at the at the mercy of the managing agent. So what can they do to speed up this process?
Rebecca, I've been told that you can email the BSF registrations team, which is the email that's provided when the application is first registered. So that is the email to use to contact the team directly.
Okay.
Can I just jump in on this, because this is where I think we start having major failures. The government legislate and set the standards for building regulations that we have to conform to. They haven't been conformed to, and they haven't been covered properly. So asking managing agents or people who might have, let's say, ulterior motives or reasons to try and avoid this problem, and I'm not saying they all do, it's ridiculous that leaseholders are being left in this scenario because people haven't submitted the right information. I actually think there should be proper government inspections. I think the government needs to set up their own group and say, we are going to fully inspect this. We're going to see what the problems are, and we're going to make sure that the funding's allocated in the way that it should be. I think starting to go through different parties or managing agents or developers or other people who might even want to be avoiding this issue is causing the delays. I actually think the government, and I know the government sometimes get blamed for everything, and we always say the government should fix everything. That's not necessarily the case in this scenario, because I think there's been faults massively through the industry who are to blame for it. But I think us as leaseholders need the assurance that the government are going to step in independently or set up some independent body to come and do those inspections, make those applications, and make sure that the right funds are allocated. Leaving it to managing agents or people who might control that building, personally, I think is ridiculous.
Well, and there's a lot of mistrust, isn't there, with agents? Jenny, is there, obviously you have to sort of liaise with these, with the buildings, have you got any views on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't answer as to how the fund can be speeded up. I think one of the things that we have raised in Greater Manchester is the need for there to be better information sharing. These are complex problems, and no building has got the same issues. We've got hundreds of pages of reports. These people need to be kept informed. So, one of the things that would really help is a central repository of information, so it's not people constantly chasing for information. I didn't realise that there was such a big issue with incomplete applications, and we do work closely with Lord Greenhalgh's team in MHCLG. So I'll certainly take away seeing if I can pick up with those officials if there are common problems and how we can support that. Because to me, it doesn't make any sense to be trying to deal with incomplete applications on a building by building basis if there's so many issues. So if we can help get guidance out to the people who are making the applications, absolutely we will. If we can run a workshop that helps them get an understanding of what they need to include, we can do that. If there's information that we hold, because we've got reams of information on these buildings, as a fire and rescue service, if we can help, we will do that. I think the point really though is, and George has made it quite well, I don't necessarily agree the government needs to come out and inspect them, but what we do need to have is a clear prioritised programme for how we target buildings. The first come first serve won't necessarily address the risk in the best way, and also we need to make sure that the remediation can be done in an appropriate timescale. And I know some residents are finding difficulty getting people to even bid for the work on their building, but if we can help, we will in Greater Manchester. That's what we try and do, work with people to make it easier.
And I think we're really lucky we've got that. Andy, do you want to come in on this?
Just quickly, I know I realise you're up against the clock, but I just want to say something, because obviously we had the lobby of Parliament a year ago today, and then the government responded and they created the Building Safety Fund. But I think it's kind of gone wrong since, and it needs to be reset, because George was saying rightly that the complexity of these buildings and situations is huge, isn't it? And therefore, if you're going to create a fund that is very rules-based with eligibility, you're going to hit problems. It's going to become too complex, I think, and that's what's happening. I think there's no criticism of the minister, because I think he's really committed to trying to sort some of these things out. It's a classic. As a former minister, I know what happens when the civil service they love the rules and the this, and he's laughing because he knows I'm right when I say this. And they over-bureaucratise things. And I would say to the government, think about going back to a principles-based approach to this. As Steve said at the beginning, no one's at fault here. The residents are not at fault. So the one people who are not to blame are them. So give them a principal commitment that it gets put right and they don't pay. And then the government needs to kind of go to industry, and maybe government pays up front, and then they have this work that you've got to get back to that. And I think for the government's perspective, if they don't do that, it will become a kind of political war of attrition eventually, because then they'll just be fighting, and we'll continue to back you, the residents, Rebecca, all the way, 100%. And I think a lot of Conservative politicians, many MPs, Conservative MPs voted last night against the government line. So I just think the government needs to take a bit of a step back here and get back to a principles-based approach to this rather than a rules-based approach. A rules-based approach with all the complexity is just going to cause more wasted effort as people argue and all the rest of it. That would, as a former minister, that's just a bit of advice, if you like. Work through Jenni and the team as well. Ask fire services everywhere to feed into this, to make it less complicated than it's becoming, I think. But who am I to know? But it's just, as I see it, it's becoming over complex, over bureaucratized, and it's going to, in the end, become quite damaging politically, I would say, for the government if they kind of carry on going up this sort of rabbit hole with all of this.
And the sort of every day that goes by and people haven't heard about their application, it's just more stress and anxiety for them. So, and it's more cost for them to be paying in insurance and waking watch in the meantime. So, so we do need the process to be as efficient as possible. So thank you, Todor. You've asked about the email address that Lord Greenhalgh referenced, so we'll circulate that afterwards for anybody that needs to chase it up. So apologies to whoever's manning that email account, but they might have a lot of emails tomorrow. Moving on, we've got a second poll now. So we've been talking about developers and sort of contributions that they should be making to this. So I'm just going to hand you back over to Giles, and he will be running the second poll.
We are against the clock, so I won't talk too much. You'll be glad to hear. A couple of quick points. So I think that email address Stephen, Lord Greenhalgh has given might be just for managing agents, because I think a lot of people in the chat are saying they're not really getting sufficient answers. Second point, I think, as we all know, it's all about how much money is actually being distributed rather than how many buildings have been assessed, because we're still not seeing the cash getting out quickly enough. Don't need to reply to that, Stephen. We'll pick that up on Monday as well. Right, the polling going so far, 165. I'm going to end it because, time against the clock. Cool. Couple of questions here. Sorry, the question is basically, has the building built on the right thing? As you can see shortly, in 1% of cases, that's 3, they've contributed.
Wow.
No is the majority, and they're no longer in existence, as it's also popped up quite a lot of times on the chat, 20% of the time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think that's the issue, is a lot of these buildings were built a long time ago and the developers have gone bust, or they set up a company specifically for that building. But then the ones that are in existence aren't, there's hardly any that are putting their hands in their pockets so far. So, we need to do something about that, because as everyone said tonight, leaseholders and residents aren't to blame for this. And, buildings have been built not in compliance with building regs at the time. They need to fix that. So we're going to move on to a question from Bethan Charles, who should be on the line. So Bethan lives in an apartment in Salford Quays. So Beth should be there. I'm just going to ask a question about developers, but I'll let you explain briefly the issues about your building as well. Hi. Oh, we can't hear you, Beth. No, we can't hear you.
Shall I do a ventriloquist thing?
Can you hear me?
Oh,
can hear you now. Fantastic.
Yeah, sorry, it was fine. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Beth. I live in Salford Quays in Greater Manchester. I've lived in my building. I bought in 2015, and our building was built in 2008. So it was only towards the end of last year that we found out that there were problems with our cladding. Thankfully, we don't have combustible cladding, but we have been listed as high risk danger related to cavity fire barriers. We had an initial quote that was sent to us, which is just outstanding. It's just incredible. It was up to potentially £100,000 per flat that we will be responsible for paying. Because we don't have the combustible cladding, it's unlikely we'll be eligible for any government funding. So I'm an NHS frontline worker. I earn an average salary, and many of the other leaseholders are, earn very average salaries. So it's a lot to ask us to pay for these historical problems. We have been in contact with the building firm who built our building. They're a very respectable firm that does a lot of work across the UK. But as George was saying, everything was signed off at the time, and they've come back to us and said that they're not liable for any costs. So the question that I really have for the panel is that there seem to be a lot of developers and builders that need approval at local authority level before securing public contracts. These companies have made huge profits from building flats that are now deemed substandard and a fire risk. So pressure could perhaps be put on some of these companies to, as they say, do the right thing, as the government really has not chosen to do this as much. So could I ask you what steps, if any, will be taken to penalise those developers and builders who refuse to step up to support leaseholders with enormous remediation costs? Because there's a lot of us that are going to be left out here. Thank you very much.
Rebecca, can I jump in just on a point associated with that rather than directly answering the question? Do you mind?
Yeah, of course, that's fine.
Okay, I think it's really interesting because you've got a building that was built in 2008. You don't have combustible cladding on the outside, but you've got issues with cavity wall fire breaks. Now, that obviously doesn't comply with the building regs, and it didn't comply with the building regs when it was built in 2008. I think, and I don't want to get into trouble for saying this, but I think this is a great example of genuinely analysing the level of risk to people's lives in the building. Now, having no cavity wall breaks, without getting too technical about it, it doesn't comply, right? But to put that right is so complicated, I cannot tell you, right? To retrospectively put in cavity wall breaks for fire protection is so difficult, hence why you're getting the most enormous bills ever, right? What needs to happen in that scenario is for someone to genuinely analyse the level of risk to you as residents and how you're able to escape from that building safely. Now, I'm not a fire officer. I've got quite a lot of experience as an architect in fire safety and means of escape, right? But I would suggest that with all of the other things that you have in your building, you could probably escape from your building safely, even though there aren't any fire breaks within the cavities. Yep. If you had combustible cladding, it would be a completely different story. You might not be able to get out of that building fast enough. Now, I shouldn't get into too much detail about a specific example, but this to me really sums up that someone's analysed your building, they found a problem that doesn't comply with the building regs, the cost to retrospectively put it right are insane. I mean, if someone asked me to do that to a building, I would have my head in my hands thinking, how on earth do I do that? But the reality is, you could probably escape from that building within a certain amount. It's normally half an hour is what you need to get out of a building maximum. Yeah, normally under a normal. That's why you have half-hour fire doors and lots of other half-hour building materials to give half an hour of protection for you to be able to get out. And you probably could do that. Now, again, I shouldn't really comment on a specific building as such, but it is an example where someone's assessed your building and said, well, that's a problem. Well, how much of a problem really is it? You know, are you able to get out of that building safely within a certain amount of time? And you probably could. So, Rebecca, I just wanted to bring that in because, for example, when someone says you've got combustible balconies, we heard that earlier. Now, if your balcony is very, very small and it became an isolated fire on one small balcony, you would be able to get out of that building and most of the people would be able to get out of it. If it was to spread from balcony to balcony to balcony to balcony because all the balconies were stacked above, then it becomes like a chimney stack and it becomes a greater fire risk. And so people have analysed individual buildings and said, this is a problem, but I'm not entirely sure, if I'm honest, the level of risk that that genuinely poses. And once the system gets involved and says that needs to be put right, I'm not saying it shouldn't be put right, but it needs to be looked at on a unique case-by-case basis to assess the level of risk. The reason why people couldn't get out of Grenfell is because I had combustible cladding. It was a windy night, it was a hot night, windows were open, Kingspan and all the other insulations and combustible materials that were. But how much of a risk is it really not having fire breaks in your cavity wall? It's some risk, but does it prevent you getting out of the building within a certain reasonable amount of time? Possibly not. I just want to throw that out there.
That, you know, and there's so many most buildings that we sort of hear about have these issues and have a lack of cavity barriers. So, you know, £100,000 is just a ridiculous amount of money. Steve, I don't know, you know, what do you think? I know it's not your city, but you know, what do you think can be done to penalise these like building firms that have done this to the buildings and yet aren't coming forward to fix it?
I think the real problem is the more opaque you make things, the more wriggle room you give everybody to say it's nothing to do with me, Gov, and then nobody's held responsible. And actually, we do need to call out those people who ultimately are responsible for these. There's a whole host of different regulations that have been broken in some of these instances. There are a whole host of different people who have flouted the law. And I've not seen many people ending up in court for the things that they've done. And it needs the government to take strong action against them. And I have to say, I think George nailed it before, but I have to say also that I thought Lord Greenhalgh also mentioned something that's of merit. And I think George was saying about it's nobody's fault. Well, it actually is. And in law, it probably is as well. And I think what Lord Greenhalgh was saying.
I didn't say that, by the way. It was the Mayor of Manchester said it's nobody's fault. I didn't say that, because it's definitely someone's fault somewhere when a building's at risk. I didn't say that.
I said the residents. It's not the residents' fault.
It did mean the residents, in fairness, but it was the way you said it, Andy. You went, no one's at fault.
Okay. Well,
but then afterwards you said the residents.
No,
you did qualify
I think it was you, George. It's your accent.
No.
Your accent. No one can understand what you're saying.
There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it. If a building is defective at the point that it was even built, somebody somewhere is at fault. I think where we're getting it, and I think where it's very, very difficult is that's why I keep talking about individual buildings. And I'm sorry to keep banging on about it, because then it becomes staggeringly illegal. Did the architect specify the building properly? Was the developer responsible for that as a client? Was it the actual manufacturer of the products that was at fault? And we've seen with Kingspan, who have been, I'm going to say this on the record, absolutely disgraceful when it comes to Grenfell. It's come out in the public inquiry. You know, the disregard that Kingspan had for the residents and safety of that building was shockingly bad. And that's public information now. They were at fault. You know, we've got companies who have been lying about testing and distorting the testing process. We could also blame building control because they have to carry out the inspections. Yeah. But in fairness to building control, if someone gives you a certificate and says this product's been tested and it's safe, and that test has been a lie, you can't blame building control for that. So this is why the system is very complex. We've got lots and lots of different people with lots of different levels of responsibility. And it's about finding out the fault individually in that building. So someone is to blame somewhere on a defective building. There's no doubt about that. It's about interrogating it to find out who that person or who that organisation was.
Sorry, Steve, but if you go on that basis, building by building, blame apportioned in that way, you'll never ever solve this. You know, it's too complex. I think what it needs is the government up front saying all buildings that are dangerous get remediated, and then we will come to a deal with industry, which probably be a windfall tax on industry, to pick up Beth's point. You know, councils can't do it, Beth, because they can't penalise through planning law somebody who did a bad building, and therefore the planning law doesn't allow that. This whole thing needs to be completely simplified. I was saying that people who aren't to blame are the residents, make their buildings safe, and then government needs to sit down with industry. There needs to be some form of windfall tax on industry, and that's how this thing needs to be resolved. And I think the complexity, if you allow this complexity to run, the legal bills will go into themselves will dwarf the cost of the building remediation.
And Andy, I completely agree with you 100% on that. But the first point that you made was all buildings will be remediated and put safe. And I'm sorry to keep putting my architect hat on, but I think sometimes the level of remediation is so difficult to do retrospectively, like cavity wall fire barriers. It's really difficult. You've probably got to pull a building apart to try and put those in. And I think it's about looking at the level of risk based on that. And I think sometimes when it's like the pendulum swinging extremely the other way, where we've had Grenfell happen, and then everybody panics and everyone feels like they need to be accountable. And the pendulum swings the other way going, we have to put these 55 things right. And I agree with you that all 55 things should be put right, but if it becomes virtually impossible to do it in the building without massive amounts
I'm
of
going to jump in now.
it's too
Sorry,
difficult.
George. Sorry, George, I'm going to jump in because I think, you know, we have to be clear when we talk about remediation, you know, maybe that's not a helpful term, is it? I think, you know, Andy's point is buildings need to be made safe. Not every building can be put back to its proper condition. And we've said that in Greater Manchester. We've said, you know, and Andy's written letters and we've submitted evidence that says we need to look for solutions. So we've got a building in Greater Manchester, New Lawrence House, where it's been, you know, it's been litigated all the way up to the Court of Appeal. They were fortunately successful in terms of the warranty claim. They're still left with a shortfall of £20,000 because it needs to be stripped back to the frame. It's that poor quality construction. Now, that can't be done for every building. So we have to look at holistic solutions. So, you know, we are looking at that on a case by case basis, but that needs the insurance industry. You know, it's one thing to say, can people get out of the building? That's what we're concerned with from a fire safety perspective. Can people get out? Are they safe? But, you know, the flip side of that is unless the insurance industry come on board, you know, we could say, well, actually, you don't need to do that massive extensive work to do that because you've got sprinklers, or you could have this, or you could have that. But then if your insurance is going to be massive because they're concerned about the loss of the property. So it's got to be a holistic solution that is based on risk, hasn't it? Not a simple, this type of cladding is, this type of cladding isn't. You know, that's, I think that's the point. And that was, and it's not for me to speak for Andy Burnham, but that's what Andy's saying. Let's make the building safe.
I agree. I don't disagree with anything at all that you've just said. I agree completely. But your Beth in Salford Keys, her point is, I bought this building that was built in 2008. It's not safe, and the fire breaks aren't in there. To retrospectively put those in is staggeringly difficult and staggeringly expensive. Then it comes back to whose fault is it? Where did the risk lie? Who should be paying for it? Now, Andy's right. If the government can pay for it up front, fantastic. Happy days. And it might take them 25 years to claw that money back, which is going to be really difficult through the courts for them. I'm just saying, I think we need to look at the level of risk generally, because I think we're getting to a stage sometimes where we're overanalyze the building because the pendulum swung the other way. And that's creating a greater level of complexity.
So, Lord Greenhalgh, I don't know if, you know, what you've got to say, and we've obviously pushed for time, but if you could keep it under a minute and respond to this. Government wants developers to do the right thing as well, but, you know, how can people like Beth enforce that?
Well, I do want to make just two very brief points. Firstly is that I'm staggered when I came into this post as a minister that there wasn't a recognised approach to measuring risk around buildings. And that's soon going to be put right with something called a PAS, which I believe stands for Publicly Available Standard. And that will then enable expert fire engineers to grade buildings according to being high, medium, or low risk. And then you can take a risk-based approach to things. But the reality is that every profession you talk to seems to have a completely different idea of how you risk stratify buildings. And that's part of the problem. And hopefully that will help in that regard. I do think with developers, which was the original question, yes, I take the point about planning, and I've been a local authority leader. I worked at City Hall for 4 years. I get where Andy's coming from, but we do want good partners in our developers, and we do want developers. And typically, when I was a leader in Hammersmith and Fulham, I knew developers that came to my borough, built good quality buildings, and came back. And you want those people, and you want a virtuous circle, and you want a relationship with people. But equally, if someone's been a bad partner, you can put pressure on them. It is, you know, it is possible within the law. You know, and I remember having a meeting with a developer in Loudon with a leader, and you know, quoting their profits at them because they simply weren't going to pay for putting in a fire alarm system into a building that required a fire alarm system, and they weren't going to remediate the cladding. And you know, collectively, we did put some pressure on them because they are a developer that wants to continue building right across London, Luton, and the home counties. So you know, I think there is a role to be played on the one hand to with those serious developers that are rebuilding the skyline of Liverpool, or you know, making Manchester into the second great city after London. You know, we can get them to make a contribution. We've seen that with the ACM fund, and I think the two mayors on the call here have the leverage to help in that regard.
We have tried to use it, Stephen. So it's not that we haven't, but it's hit and miss is all I would say to you. It doesn't definitely give Beth a solution. It can help maybe, but I'm not certain it will deliver a solution for everybody. And I just think it's got to be done more in a simplified national basis, big agreement between industry and government, and recognising 2008, well, that was government I was in. So government, it's of all colours, by the way, Stephen, this isn't party political. All governments failed with the regulations. So therefore government has a culpability, but industry failed as well, because there's plentiful evidence that they cut corners and failed. Government and industry, big funding package, simplify it for the leaseholders and the residents. I think you'd be so much better off as a government if you went at it like that, rather than the arguments that are now going to come and the this and this building and that. I mean, George has given us an insight into that level of complexity. I think, you know, it will just become a war of attrition that nobody will win from, to be honest.
And it's only government that can bang heads together.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Beth. Obviously, that got everybody got some real debate going around that issue. It's really important, so thank you for that. So moving on to our last question. Obviously, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of residents across the country, you know, wondering what their future looks like, and they have, you know, the greatest fears for what's going to happen to them, you know, financially and their mental health. So our sixth question comes from Hayley Tillotson, who on my screen is currently sideways. I don't know if she has to turn it. So Hayley was a leaseholder of an apartment in Leeds, but I'll let her explain what's happened with her and ask her question. Thanks, Hayley.
Yeah, that's right. I was a leaseholder, I was a homeowner, and then in December last year, I went bankrupt as a result of the interim measures and the fire safety bills I was paying. So yeah, December, I've got no flat, no anything. Everything I've ever earned and saved since the age of 18 to 28 that I am now, that's gone. So I'm starting again now from £0, 0 pence. I will be paying back loans and things for the next 3 years, the insolvency service. And actually my building in Leeds, I say mine, it never complied with building regulations at all at the time it was built. No, it was signed off as safe, and it wasn't safe. We've actually only got 10% cladding, like barely any cladding at all, but we've got everything else you could possibly imagine wrong with it. You name it, we've got it. So here I am, completely ruined on the end of my tether, basically, and all my neighbours are hanging on by a thread. I won't bang on too long because time, but yeah, loads of people have messaged me, hundreds of people have messaged me to say that they are so close to bankruptcy. It's insane.
And what, you know, it's the worst case scenario. It's what everybody, you know, is fearing. So, you know, what's your question for everyone this evening, Hayley?
Yeah, so obviously Manchester's at Skyline Central have already been forced to take life-changing loans for issues they didn't cause. I've already been made bankrupt due to fire safety and interim costs. And at least one person has already taken their own life as a result of the stress and worry caused by fire safety costs and interim measures. So to be honest, my question is exactly how bad is the government going to let this get before they step up and give us some meaningful action and so for once and for all sort out this building safety crisis? Like, legal protection for leaseholders is the only way to stop the madness. We need legislation, not loans for under 18 metres. And you can't throw £5 billion at a 15 billion problem. So really, Greenhalgh, really, how long are we going to be led on for and waiting? Because honestly, when I say my neighbours are this close to bankruptcy, I flaming mean it.
Yeah, so I mean, Lord Greenhalgh, obviously we'll come to you first because Hayley directed it to you. I mean, you know, how far is it going to go? You know, how many more people, you know, need to be made bankrupt? You know, God forbid anyone else is forced to take their life. You know, what is government going to do to solve this?
I obviously had forewarning of this question, and I thought there's nothing I'm going to say that's going to answer it in any way, shape or form. And I really feel for you, Hayley. It's horrendous for you to put everything into owning your own home. And that's the dream that we all have, to own our own home. and to do that in your 20s is quite a feat, and I'm so sorry to hear about your circumstances. But what I'd say is, before this announcement, we had a commitment of £1 billion, and to then get out of Treasury, and effectively it is a big battle to get money out of the National Bank, that's the Department of Treasury, to get £3.5 billion in additional direct government grant is quite a step forward. So that is progress. It does pay for the remediation of external cladding systems, and those are the very parts of the building that accelerate the spread of fire, as opposed to missing fire breaks or internal compartmentation issues, which really are designed to stop the spread of fire. And that goes down to the point that George has made about risk. But there's nothing I'm going to say that can answer that, because we've made our statement about where, as a government, and I don't have any more news. So, I have to sort of take the shrapnel and the bullets for the position we find ourselves in. But I do think it's a massive step forward to put forward an additional £3.5 billion upfront cash to remove the biggest source of the fire safety risk, which is the unsafe flammable cladding.
I'd rather have legislation than money, but yeah, thanks. I'd rather have legal protection than a few billion quid. Legal protection to make freeholders, not leaseholders, pay.
Yeah, and I think, do you know what, Hayley? I think you've nailed it. It's like you had nobody to turn to. Had nobody that had your back. And we've all agreed as a panel that it's not the leaseholder's fault. You are not responsible for the faults in that building. So to get to the stage where you've been declared bankrupt, I think it's a national disgrace. I think it's absolutely outrageous. Where was any form of protection for you to be able to turn to? And in fact, more than anything, you've been attacked from all sides and people shirking that responsibility. And I actually think, I would say this to Greenhalgh, I think the government need to actually retrospectively step in on situations like Hayley and give her some support to get out of it, because I think it's a disgrace for the system to say, oh well, we're sorry it's happened. Sorry about that, Hayley. Good luck. See you later. Bye. No way, she's been declared bankrupt for something that was not her fault, and she had nobody to turn to within the system. And the only people that can step in to legislate for that and make it work and correct that massive wrong is government, and that's where they do genuinely have to step in. You can't just say, oh, we've given some money to sort out cladding. Sorry about that, Hayley. Good luck in your life. You can't do that. That has to be a retrospective. You can't fix someone taking their life. You can't fix that. That's gone, which is tragic. But Hayley, who's going to help her now? There should be there should be a direct government response to people like Hayley or people on the verge of bankruptcy to say we are not going to allow anyone to become bankrupt because it was not their fault.
And just moving to Ellen now, I mean, Ellen, obviously you've heard what's happened with Hayley, and, this had a huge impact on mental health. For most people that we speak to, what's your view on that?
I mean, I think everybody who's here gathered in this panel, and I think reading the comments as well, is agreeing that this is a systemic problem that requires a systemic issue, a solution. And I think what I'm hearing from everybody who's contributed and asked the questions is that these are individuals who are being affected. And I think we're all saying the same thing, but it's actually you who are carrying the burden of this. And in this, it feels like this is classic populist politics, trying to divide people and trying to push down all the time the blame out to individuals. And we're standing in solidarity with you, but it actually requires a government to hold everybody accountable to this. And whoever at the end is responsible, it isn't you, Hayley. Now, that's easy for me to say, I'm not in your position, but it isn't you who is responsible for this. And I think it really does require a systemic solution. And I think we're all in agreement with that. And I think, as Andy and others have said, it has to stop now, because real life, when we talk about homes, we're not, when developers talk about these buildings, they're talking about buildings. When you talk about your space, the place that you lived in, you're talking about your home, and you've lost your home. I was declared bankrupt in 2001, and I know the pain and the suffering that caused. And I am absolutely gutted for you. And I think that, you should not be sitting there alone in this. You have these people, and even, Lord Greenhalgh is actually trying to find a solution. And we're saying, try harder, please do more. please get a solution that is a systemic solution, but has individuals, the real life people at its heart.
Well, I think on that point, it's a simple thing, Ellen, that the government should say we will not allow anyone to become personally bankrupt because of a debt that wasn't their fault, or an imposed bill that's been put onto them that wasn't their fault. They could do that tomorrow.
Life forever.
Yeah, and they could do it tomorrow.
But there was a vote in Parliament last night which would have done that, which would have said leaseholders can't be responsible and it's freeholders, and it was voted down.
What?
So they could have done it. They could have done it yesterday.
Done it yesterday, George.
You said they could have done it tomorrow. They could have done it yesterday.
I mean, that is unbelievable, Andy. I mean, honestly,
it's heartbreaking.
And the thing is, obviously, bankruptcy stays with you, for a long time, and it's very final, and why should residents have to go through this? I say this is a fear for lots of residents. Andy, how can we prevent this? How can we support these people?
I mean, I'll let Steve have the final word. I'll keep it short, but I mean, it's what we're saying, isn't it? Government's partly responsible, industry's partly responsible. So simplify it between yourselves and get it sorted. And the final thing I would say, Rebecca, is I just think it's kind of poignant we can't meet personally tonight. We're doing this all from our own homes. This should have been done last year when we had the lobby of Parliament. There shouldn't really been any arguments going on anymore, really. But now we're in a pandemic when everyone has suffered as a result of that, where some people haven't had public support. It's just morally, it cannot really be allowed to go on much further than this because of the damage to people's mental health, the loss of life, as Hayley sort of said tonight, tragically. It has to just be fixed. It's going to become a kind of another crisis on top of the mental health crisis on top of the pandemic if we let people suffer in this way. It's just kind of multiple layers of stress and anxiety that will sink people, basically. So I'll leave it to Steve for the final word, but it should have been, even before the pandemic, it was like a moral case was absolute. Now it's like, and I give credit to the minister. He's here, it's 7:15, he's still here, he's listening, he's taking it on board. I actually think he's got really good intentions, but I do say, I understand what it's like to be a minister in a government when you're trying to get something done and not everyone's pulling with you. Yes, it's good, Stephen, that the Treasury's given 3 billion. Just it's got to be the amount that's cost to fix the problem, because it's never going to be right for the people who can't have it fixed because the fund's not enough. It just needs an entire solution, I think, as Jenni was saying before. And then the government should go and get it back, some of it from the industry, because they're to blame too. So I don't know. That's how. But Steve, you and I met some people excluded from public support last night, didn't we? And we know that some of the people with the cladding crisis are also people who've had barely any income over the last year, and this is becoming a bit of a human tragedy, isn't it, on lots of levels.
Yeah, and one of the problems that we all have is getting our head around the sums that we're talking about. And in all honesty, once you get beyond a few million, people don't really understand whether it's 1 billion, 13 billion, 100 billion. It's just huge mouth-watering, eye-watering sums of money. But whatever it currently is, it's not enough, because it's not fixing the problem. It's fixing some problems for some people, but not for everybody. And we all know the consequences of not doing something. 72 people died. You might be talking about bricks and mortar. I'm a former brickie myself. But 72 people died. 72 human beings with families, with lives ahead of them, hopefully with great things that they would have all achieved. And that was taken from them because people were to blame and a system let them down. And so it's right that the governments should, and the legal system should, hold those people to account. But also we need to put right the problem that still exists in other areas. And when we talk about, flats and stuff like that, again, it is about, the surroundings, but it's also people's lives. And there are people today who are living through a nightmare of not being able to sleep properly, wondering whether they're going to go bankrupt, wondering whether they're going to be, hit by huge increases in insurance bills. You talked, Lord Greenhalgh, about insurance companies shouldn't be allowed to profiteer from this. Legislate, stop them from profiteering, make certain that they don't, because it is a national disgrace, George. It's a national disgrace that some of this we can stop from happening. We can stop it being exacerbated, certainly, and we can't turn the clock back. We know those buildings have been built inappropriately, but we need to do something about it, and we need to help people as much as we possibly can.
Well, I think we should turn the clock back for people like Hayley, though. To be honest, Steve, I think we should turn the clock back for them. She shouldn't be bankrupt.
Yeah, it's not turning the clock back. It's helping Hayley now.
Yeah, exactly.
There was the chance, as Andy said, through Parliament and you know, parliamentarians voted in a certain way last night, and questions need to be asked about that. But just on the final note, I've seen this in lots and lots of other things, lots of things that have happened. And Grenfell happened, and there's this huge swell of support publicly. And then things are left for a little bit, and then it starts to dissipate and die down a little bit. The way in which we get all governments of all persuasions, all governments to do things is through pressure, and you get pressure through people banding together and doing the things that you did, lobbying and continuing to raise questions and getting members of Parliament to stand up and to point out the folly of some of the processes and the legislation in Parliament. That's how you'll get change. And at the end of the day, no government wants to lose power. And the same with excluded and forgotten. Those people will never forget if they believe that the governments have stood by and watched them as they've suffered. And that's a lesson for all politicians, I think.
Steve and I were still in a courtroom 25 years after Hillsborough, weren't we? Where people were still fighting. And really, we cannot possibly let this situation descend into something like that, where the Grenfell families who are outraged today because of what happened in Parliament yesterday, you know, we cannot possibly allow a repeat of that kind of situation where no one takes the blame, everyone points at everyone. You know, we've seen it too often in this country. You know, I just appeal to the minister's not the person, I think he is with us in spirit, to be honest. I just appeal to the government, you know, all parties have got some blame here. Let's get a national solution, take the weight off the shoulders of these residents, and remember Ellen's words as we leave tonight. This is their homes and their lives, not a building that needs making safe. You know, it's everything that matters to them, and you know that's where we should go from here. But anyway, a really good event.
Thanks, and thank you. Hey, sorry, Ellen, did you want to come back in?
Because I recognise that one of the legacies potentially of this conversation will be how we help Lord Greenhalgh to refocus the government in terms of how we have a fair, sustainable housing policies as we go forward. It's a refocus, I think, that we're calling here, and if we can help you to do that, because I think you do want our help and you want us to be able to stand in solidarity with each other, and also with the efforts that you have already put in place. So you've got some really fantastic people here who can help you to do even better and even more to help people like Hayley and all the other people that we've spoken to this evening. So do please help us to do that, help you to do that.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you. And thank you, Hayley, because, you know, you've been through absolute hell and yet you're still here, you know, you're still campaigning on behalf of everybody else. And, you know, I think, you know, that's really commendable. So, you know, so thank you so much for everything that you do for the campaign. And I'm just sorry that, you know, we're all very sorry that you're a victim of this.
Yeah, not about me, but no, thank you so much for having me. It's all, my neighbours are literally inches away from following me. I don't want this to happen to anybody else ever, but it's a matter of days and weeks for some cases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's all of our questions. We've just got one final poll, which Giles will come on and do now. So hopefully he is on camera.
Hello, I'm here. Yeah.
The Q&A has been going crazy.
It has indeed. We'll get a report on that. So we'll try to either reflect those questions being answered. We have been reflecting them because obviously we've been trying to represent residents the last 2 or 3 years. So we do have meetings with the ministers. And again, the main thing is that We want a proper risk-based solution. We just need something that works for everyone now, that protects us and holds true to the words about protecting us from costs. So the final poll that we're going to launch is about financial implications. So it's a quick one with 4 answers there, 4 sentences that best describe your situation. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to also bring in Julie Fraser, who's Liverpool Cladiators lead. Slight error of mine previously for not promoting her earlier. So Julie's here. And 130 people so far. I'll leave it running for another couple of seconds. I think with that far past time, we're not really counting anymore, are we? An hour or so, possibly.
But there's too much to say. That's the problem. That's, there's lots of complexities.
There is. Right. I'll share the results now. So, which of the sentences best describes your personal situation? Haven't borrowed, 67%, but think we'll need to. And we've got 10% of people who already have borrowed. So, Rebecca, back to you and Julie.
Yeah, so lots of people that are facing borrowing money, and in a middle of a global pandemic where you've had people who've been furloughed, people who've lost jobs, and the only way they can pay these bills is to try and get credit from somewhere. It's just a disaster, waiting to happen. It's already ruining lives. Okay, so thank you to everybody for their time. Obviously, we are way over time. Whilst I know everyone here could talk for hours on this topic, unfortunately, that's all the time that we do have. As we've heard tonight, there's lots of outstanding issues that need, urgent attention. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Every day that goes by for us feels like a lifetime. People can't sleep out of fear for their safety or concerns about how they're going to pay bills or fix the problems that they didn't cause. They then have to get through each day worrying about money, consumed by what we term cladmin, which is like the admin that surrounds all of this. People are unable to move. They're unable to move on with their lives. They can't start families. Some have worked all their lives and they can't retire. Many people are seeing doctors about the impact on their mental health. And more worryingly, there's a lot more people that are just suffering in silence. So we're all still trapped in unsafe buildings. And this has felt even worse over the last year where we've had to be locked down in our homes. So in less than 4 months, it will be 4 years since the Grenfell tragedy. Why has the government not properly assessed the full scale of this building safety crisis? How can people still be living in these dangerous buildings? And how are people like Hayley being forced into bankruptcy to pay for someone else's mistakes? All she did was buy a home. How can we stand by whilst more people take their lives? This has to stop. There must be a proper, effective, and more importantly, a fair solution for everybody. So we implore government and any developers to do the right thing. They need to fix the problems that they caused through years of regulatory failures and failures to build in compliance with the regulations which were in place. So we're the innocent victims of this crisis, and it's clearly a national scandal, which has been referenced this evening many times. It must end now, and so that we can all just get on with our lives. So thank you for everyone joining us for Cladding Question Time. A huge thank you to all our panel members, and for the extra time that you've given us this evening. I know Julie wanted to say thank you as well from Liverpool Cladiators.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Given all this time, I'm sorry we've gone over so long, but I think it's been brilliant. And, Ellen, especially thank you for your honesty. That's just amazing to hear that and how that will help other people. So thank you to everybody. And Giles, Mr. Technoman, for setting all of this up.
So thank you. And as Giles said, we'll try and pick up any other questions in the Q&A, and and we'll try and pick those up afterwards. And Lord Greenhalgh, we're all here, as Ellen said. We all want the same thing. So if there's anything that we can do to try and help resolve the situation, please use us, because we need a solution. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks very much. Take care. Stay safe, everyone.